Hey, thanks everybody for coming tonight, and thank you for indulging me for a few minutes now and taking a little trip down memory lane. I've been rather nostalgic the last couple of weeks as I've wrapped things up after 15 years on the bench. First, I'd like to say thank you to my lovely partner Drew for putting together all this video. Drew and I did not meet until after the primary in 1994. If we had met during the campaign, we probably wouldn't be together. Some people I know some of you are saying, you're wondering why we're still together now, but it's another thing. Thank you, my vida, I love you. 15 years of support. You got thrown into the middle of this craziness when I was sworn in, and suddenly he had to make his way through the political crowd. That was quite a thing to do. I want to begin, I guess, and some people may have heard this before, but you remember our old gay community center upstairs at Ann Sather's? Yeah. Folks remember when that was our gay community center? Thank you, Tom Tunney. I wish he was here to hear the thanks, because Ann Sather's was our place to go. And it was election night, November 1992. Some of you might remember being there that night. We were watching Bill Clinton get elected. We were watching more women being elected to the United States Senate and to Congress than ever before. There was this new little thing in Cook County for the judges called the Subcircuits, and more women and African Americans and Latinos were being elected to the Circuit Court of Cook County than ever before in 1992. But there was one thing that we saw that was missing that night. There were no openly gay candidates on the ballot running. There was nobody elected. None of us were there. None of us were going to be taking our place at the table. And those of you who remember being there that night, remember that we pledged that in the next election cycle, we would make that change. We would make a difference. We would have people on the ballot. We would make the breakthrough. And so that's really what started me that night, November 1992 election night, thinking about doing this. It made sense. The 8th Subcircuit for judges was up here in our territory. Gee, if we couldn't win here, if we couldn't make the breakthrough here, where were we going to be able to do that? So that's when I started to develop my campaign. As of late 1992, going into 1993. That's when I started talking to people. There were a couple of other people who were thinking about running at the same time. Sebastian, I didn't get to say hi tonight. Sebastian Patty was one of those folks. And Jim Schwartz was the other one. And they very graciously stepped aside at that time and said, you know what? We need a clear shot for one person to see if we can make that breakthrough. And they agreed that I would be that person. You know, it could be Sebastian sitting here very easily instead of me. I was fortunate that they were gracious enough to do that, and off we went. Now, one of the things that we decided early on to do was this. This very important symbol to anyone who would recognize it in the gay community, people who were Jewish, understanding that this was the symbol that the Nazis marked us with in those concentration camps. This was the symbol that we went to our deaths with. This is the symbol of oppression for gay and lesbian folks, just like the Star of David was for the Jews. So we wore that as a badge of honor in this campaign. And there were some people even in 1994, overt discrimination really wasn't at play, but there was subtle discrimination that was going on. When I went before the Judicial Evaluation Committee of the Chicago Bar Association, I said that, it was time to diversify the bench in Cook County. It was time for a qualified, openly gay man to be elected. That was part of my campaign. And rather than look at all of my qualifications, you know what they saw? This. They saw this badge. That's all that they were able to see. They didn't look at me as a full human being with the qualifications that I had. Joy Cunningham can testify to my treatment by the Chicago Bar Association. And then the way Art talked about the way we worked out not having a slated candidate in my race. You know, all of the committeemen came around to supporting me, except for one. One who was the former chairman of the Democratic Party in Cook County, who decided to support a person who had run as a Republican 2 years before, rather than support me because he still couldn't abide no queers in 1994. Those were the kinds of things that we faced, but they were far, far exceeded by the people of goodwill who came along to support my campaign. People like my boss at the time, Nikki Zoller.
Oh, Nikki!
You know, Nikki goes back to the wars, to the Harold Washington days, the wars back then. She understood what it meant to have one of your own representing you. She understood what it would mean to have that. And she stood supporting me at the time. There were people like Peg Ruff, the committeeman of the 43rd Ward, who extorted her committee people to get out and help me. And folks who stood out in the cold with me, like Mike Vellini up here, the committeeman of the 48th Ward. Mike didn't know me from Adam, but Mike understood, largely because people like Greg Harris had been talking to him about what this meant to the gay community. Mike stood out there on the L platforms with me, freezing cold at 6:30 in the morning, thrusting out his bare hand saying, "Hi, I want you to meet this guy who's running for judge, support him." He didn't have to do that, but he knew the importance of it. People like Pat O'Connor over here in the 40th Ward, who put me on as one of his featured races, and that meant incentives for his workers. If they brought in the featured races, they got incentives. People like Dick Mell, who was looking to get a certain son-in-law of his elected to Congress a couple of years later. All of the women elected officials along the lakefront, people like Carol Ronan, who was state rep then, and Judy Irwin, Alderman Mary Ann Smith, and Alderman Helen Schiller, were all backing me. A big name in Democratic politics like Mike Howlett, whose dad was governor and who had been a judge. J.B. Pritzker came out in support. Sarah Fagenholtz, before she was elected, she was running that year for state rep when I was running. Mike Quigley, long before he was ever elected to the county board or as congressman. Larry Suffredin, Sam Toya from Leonis. All of these straight folks of goodwill understood what it meant to our community and got on board. But the real wind beneath my wings, I think back at that time, were all of the people I had met over the years from my playing softball and volleyball and my bowling teams, and people who I ran with in the front runners in our triathlon group and the Smelt swim group, and people who I had worked with at Howard Brown to start the program for PWAs, and people who delivered meals for Open Hand, and people who worked at Horizons and who lobbied for Impact in the Federation for Human Rights. All of these folks came out. They got people to sign petitions and volunteered to stuff envelopes and had house parties, dozens of house parties where they invited their friends and neighbors and invited people in for coffee and cocktails and help us raise awareness and raise money to fuel this campaign. They were the wind beneath my wings. Folks like Jeff Grinspoon and Dick Yavari, who's here tonight, Dave Bartnick, Russ Kletke, John Kennedy, and Steve Wood. Mike McCrae came out of nowhere, out of the woodwork, didn't know me from Adam, but knew what it might mean to this community and did a great big fundraiser up in Evanston for me. Kevin Baltz and Greg Foll, who were here earlier. My old workmate from the Attorney General's office, Dean Hansel, who moved to Los Angeles and had a fundraiser for me out there. Mary and Doug, my tenants who invited people in.